Welcome to Washington State Wire's virtual conversation with some of Washington State's most thoughtful policy leaders. And now your host, DJ Wilson.
Hello and welcome to this virtual conversation here at the Washington State Wire. We're super excited to have you in our metaphorical room here together. My name is DJ Wilson, one of the hosts here at the Washington State Wire, trying to bring together folks working on both sides of the aisles to elevate the policies, the politics, and the personalities that make Washington State government work. So we're super excited to have this kind of debrief session today, just a few days, really a few weeks after the end of the 105-day session. We've got four of the most important players in this session, particularly on the Democratic side of the aisle. The deputy majority leaders, but Deputy Majority Leader Senator Manka Dhigra is with us. Deputy Majority Leader Senator Rebecca Saldaña is with us. Chair of the House Environment and Energy Committee, Representative Joe Fitzgibbon, and of course the Majority Whip from the great 3rd District in downtown Spokane, Representative Marcus Riccelli. I appreciate all of you guys being here with us. Thanks. So, Senator Dhigra, let me just start with you. Let me ask you kind of this personal question. It was a big session for progressives. What was it like to be part of it? Did it feel like, as you were going through it, that it was going to become something that was not just a normal session, but that it was bigger than a normal session? What was it like running through this 105-day session?
You know, I have to say a lot of this started over the interim with the death of George Floyd. The energy and the interest in government that I saw, given that, as well as COVID, actually had us building up to the session. And so what I saw really was nonstop work all last year because of what our communities were going through. And so I have to say, coming into the session, I was a little apprehensive because we were going to do this remotely. We'd had a few practice sessions, and let me tell you, the first one, I was very nervous about the way it went, but we did multiple practice sessions. And when session started, I truly was impressed by how smoothly it went from a technology perspective. What I loved was the access that individuals had to government and to us. It really went beyond any expectations I had that this remote session would make us so much more available to the average person. The number of individuals that signed in to show support for a bill the numbers were just astonishing how many people were paying attention. So it really wasn't just a session. It was all last year and the build up to the session. And I think the expectations from our communities were very high. They expected us to deliver because the year 2020 gave us perfect vision. It clearly made us see the inequities that exist in our society, all the way from access to education, broadband, health, criminal justice, equity, you name it. And COVID clearly articulated that for us. And I think the session, we simply delivered on what Washingtonians expected us to do.
Representative Fitzgibbon, when did you know that this would become a historic session? When did it feel like this was going to be a session of some big environmental wins?
I don't think that really sinks in for me until after session is over, right? There's no time to sort of dwell on your victories in session, right? You get one bill passed and barely have time to take half a breath before you got to move on to the next big thing to work on. So it takes me a couple of days after session before I realize, wow, this was a really big session, not just on environmental wins, but on our entire Democratic agenda. I think as you start to approach the finish line, you realize, wow, that most of the things that we set out to do we're getting done, which was somewhat true in 2019 as well. I think in a long session with a reasonable sized majority, we just have a lot more success with that than we did my first 8 years in office. But I don't think that. At least for me, I can usually tell when we're right in the thick of session how all these things aggregate into a historic year.
Yeah. How about you, Senator Saldaña? Good Lord, Saldaña. I'm adding an S to the end of Representative Fitzgibbon's name, and I'm messing up everyone's title. Senator Saldaña, how about you? Are there things left undone? I know the transportation work is still a conversation we'll get to, but do you feel like you ran the table on the topics that y'all wanted to get done?
Yeah, I mean, we made significant progress. I think to what Senator Dhigra began with is that since last interim, we were meeting as leadership with the House leadership, with the governor's office, and checking in with our ranking counterparts of, because we had unprecedented unemployment. All of our offices became frontline casework head hubs to help our constituents try to weather this storm of the pandemic, of having businesses close and shut down. And so there was a connectivity that we had in terms of, the need for us to rise. And I think you'll remember also that we had a Senate interim committee, a special committee that was looking at long-term recovery and chaired by Senator Frocht and having the ranking be Senator Short, that we met with folks throughout the year to hear what is the right response. And it was really important, I think, going in that we needed to approach this recession because this recession is like no other, with the triple pandemic of public health, with the COVID-19, with the uprisings because of the murder of George Floyd, and the impact on our economy, was unprecedented. And so I think we all felt that push to really try to tackle, the upside down tax system and trying to make it more fair, of making sure that we were going to make the biggest investment in childcare in our history, that we were going to address police accountability and climate, and many more things that I'll let my colleagues add on to. And so, I mean, I think that was, was a unique moment for us to be in. So, but to your question of, do we have more to do? Yes. And I think, we left some things, to your point. We'll talk more about the Blake decision, but I think, our interim work is, how do we restructure our systems and institutions for restorative justice? How do we make sure that we are addressing the underlying and really uprooting what the causes for homelessness, and the fact that we have people treating their mental health issues with drugs, and the real system, pandemic of addiction. And, how do we address that? It's in every one of our families, in every one of our neighborhoods, in every town right now is, we're seeing the impact of people not having a safety net, and having that health issue result in them being on the streets. And so I think that is big work that we have to do, and we have to be able to make sure around equity in our school system is making sure that when kids come back to school and are in school right now, that we're not just going back to the way things were, but really trying to have the kind of workforce and system that meets the multilingual and ethnic communities of Washington today. And of course, the last thing will be making sure that we have a transportation system that is going to build the kind of future transportation system we need, that is greener, that is giving people real freedom and choices to move or not move when and where they want. And that is, the interim work that we'll be doing.
Good stuff. I want to also remind folks who are here with us that you can pose questions, just as I see Tiffany Elliott has done, and we'll integrate those into our conversation here today. If you're watching this on TVW, you can join this conversation live when they happen. You can track that at thewashingtonstatewire.com, where we are hosting this. Representative Riccelli, Tiffany asks about the capital gains, and I'll pose that here in a second, but I want to ask you as Majority Whip, what was the difference this year in terms of trying to get a capital gains bill across the finish line? What made it different this year than each of the last 8 or 10 sessions where that's been in the background?
Yeah, well, I think first and foremost, our caucus came ready to try and figure out how we can support people hit hardest by the pandemic, but also not just in this window of time, using it as an opportunity to really do sustainable reform that will change the way we do business in Washington State, that really levels the playing field for all people. And so that was, really important coming into this, looking at how we're meeting people's basic needs, but not just during this pandemic. How are we setting us on a course? We're not kicking the can down the road. We're not just trying to do things in 2-year windows, and we're not doing things that are just in an emergency type scenario. We're looking at sustainable change. And that was galvanized by what Senator Dhigra said, by prioritizing the needs of Black, Brown, and Indigenous communities, by really putting our trusted community organizations at the center of our work. And at the end of the day, a budget is a reflection of our values as a state. And it was a broad commitment to just, look at how we do business, how we can change, and how we can make things work for everybody and not just few. And I think that was embraced in a way that I've never seen in my time in the legislature. And it makes it a lot easier to get votes for priorities when people are all lined up in that scenario. And I saw us galvanized in a way I haven't before.
How much of, Representative Riccelli, how much of the capital gains bill is about, at least amongst members of your caucus, how much of it was about new tax revenue? How much of it was about shifting the regressivity of Washington State's tax code? And how much of it was about the long game of trying to challenge the precedent in the Supreme Court about the definition of income's connection to property?
Yes, DJ. No, I'm just kidding. It's about all those things, right? It was extremely important as we've been slogging on this to have this discussion and bring it front and center to actually get something across. And I know our Senate colleagues got tired of us saying, we got the votes, we got the votes. It was important for us to do something as a legislature to send that statement. But, at the end of the day, a lot of the folks, the voters, they send us there to get stuff done, and to just continually have these conversations without seeing movement can really deflate the direction that we're headed. And so I think it was absolutely critical on a number of fronts that you mentioned, and very important to get it across the finish line. Now, for me, a lot of people forget, well, we're not the most diverse district in Spokane in the 3rd district. We're one of the most impoverished. So, just across my county borders Idaho, if we had a tax structure that was similar to theirs, billions of dollars would come into our state that we're missing out on. So I think it's absolutely crucial when we're talking about leveling the playing field and making sure everybody has a fair opportunity to thrive in our state.
Representative Fitzgibbon, what was the difference this year about that got cap and trade across the finish line, that got clean fuel standard across the finish line, the idea that by 2030 we may be able to phase out fossil fuel internal combustion cars? Those are some big steps. What was different this year, given that you've been working on some of these ever since you've been in the legislature?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I don't know that there's sort of one factor that changed that made it possible. It was really like every session until now, we've been laying the groundwork for these big wins. 2 years ago, we had enormous climate wins with the passage of 100% clean electricity, with a clean buildings bill, with an appliance efficiency bill. And those sector by sector policies took the place of the economy-wide policy that we, had the capacity for this year. But we were also still coming off of, the second defeat in a row of a carbon tax initiative. I think every time we've had an economy-wide carbon price debate in this state, whether in the legislature or at the ballot, we've learned more about what mattered to voters, what mattered to legislators, what mattered to stakeholders, and what was going to be the most successful policy. And I just think we drew from all that experience. We just kept trying until we got it done. It didn't hurt that we had strong majorities in both chambers. When you have a bill pass the Senate with 25 votes, it's clear that every single election that Democrats won mattered for that victory. And so I wish the climate were not the partisan issue that it is, but it is. And as long as it is, climate activists and people who care about a safe climate need to focus on electing Democrats until we see a change in how Republican legislators choose to approach the issue. So I think that was a big change. On clean fuels, it really was just a matter of keeping at it. This was the fourth year the bill's been introduced. It was the third year the bill passed the House. And, I think we had a lot of really focused, Senator Saldaña in particular, and I had a lot of really focused conversations, sent from last session on through this session about, what is that pathway going to look like? And I really think it's just a testament on both bills more than anything to the persistence of the environmental community, of the governor, and of legislators, and really of citizens elevating the importance of climate in their eyes. I think COVID played a role too, because there's so many parallels between the COVID experience and climate change, in that it's the kind of problem where you're better off if you listen to scientists and follow their advice to act early rather than waiting until it's too late. I also think that the historic wildfire season that we had in September of 2020 increased the urgency for everybody. And the legislators that I talked with in both House and Senate caucuses about this just knew that saying no wasn't an okay answer right now. It was more like, what do we need to do to get to yes? And that, I think, spanned the political spectrum in our caucuses, from some of our very most moderate members to some of our very most progressive members. And I think that all those factors, I think, were ingredients in our ultimate success with those two bills.
Senator Dhigra, connect some dots for me. On the one hand, I know you led off with George Floyd. Police reform and accountability was a central priority for Democrats in this session, heading into this session. How much was that issue further catalyzed by the fact that we have a more diverse legislature now, more people of color, more women, particularly in the Senate? And also, how much was it catalyzed just by the nature of the conversation taking place in society in 2020 and having us all, particularly white people like me, having us have to relearn about how far we have to go to have a more equal and just and anti-racist society. How do those things connect in this session?
Thank you, DJ. That is such a great question, because I think it truly was about timing that enabled us to make the progress that we did. It had a lot to do with the fact that we were going through a pandemic where people were in their homes. We did not have blockbuster Hollywood movies coming out. We didn't have new content on our TV screens. What we had was a woman who recorded the murder of George Floyd, and that's what everyone watched. What was extremely compelling is the district that I represent are the cities of Redmond, Woodinville, Duval, Kirkland. Each of these cities had a Black Lives Matter protest. We normally don't see that happening in suburban cities. I've been working on police accountability and criminal justice reform for decades, and it's always been the same people around the same table. And that was not the case. It wasn't just the Democrats. It wasn't just the people of color. It was everyone in my suburban cities demanding that we do something, because what they saw shocked their consciousness. We had beautiful protests with law enforcement and our youth together saying this is unacceptable behavior. So that really is what drove a lot of us to make that change, because the community was behind us and they expected us to act. And that expectation and role of government was also something that I've seen change over the years. And again, I say it's because of COVID. People really saw the role that government can play in improving people's lives. And once they saw that, and they saw that the solution had to come from government, that impetus to act was there. And one of the things that happened very early on is the House and the Senate decided that we were going to start working together in order to develop our priorities for 2021. So definitely the Public Safety and the Law and Justice Committee in the House and the Senate, we worked together all interim to really talk about our police accountability bills, what they would look like, who would lead. And it was very clear that we needed to center the voices of Black and brown people. And at that time in the Senate, we did not have a single Black senator. In November, that changed with the election of Senator Tawana Nobles. But before then, we didn't have a single Black voice in our Senate. And so we very purposefully centered the voice of community. And I think that is what led us to the slew of bills that we passed around police accountability. Some of them were bipartisan, and some of them did have the support of law enforcement as well, because we have some excellent officers, and they too are appalled by what they saw, and they expect better and they want better. And to me, this really is about our entire community coming together and saying that we need to hold people accountable. And that's why I'm so proud that we were able to lead as a state nationally on police accountability bills.
Senator Dhigra, let me stick with you for a second on this question of the legislature's role on the question of qualified immunity for some public safety unions, particularly police officers. That feels like a lingering important topic that we as a society need to address. I know there's a diversity of opinion on that. Where do you think the topic of reforming qualified immunity is? What work will be done on the interim ahead of the next session?
So Rep. Ty had a bill dealing with that, and I was actually hopeful it would pass the House, and it didn't. And just earlier this week, I know all of us got an email from her about attending a legal education class so that all the colleagues can be educated on it. You know, we have to take a look at liability all across our state, and in the manner in which we assign liability and to whom and for what actions. And I think that's a much larger discussion, especially in terms of police accountability and law enforcement, but also in terms of the manner in which that comes up in our criminal justice reform work. So lots more work to be done there, and it's something that we're not stopping. We're going to continue working on the liability piece all through the interim.
Senator Saldaña, how about from where you sit? How has the lens of equity been added to the policymaking conversation in the legislature in a way that it hasn't been, earlier in just in recent years? How has that changed, or how was that changed in this legislative session?
I think a couple of reasons and ways, and that has happened. I mean, it definitely does change the tenor of a conversation when you have different people at the table. And, I think I've been, when I came in, I was in the minority in the Senate, and I was the only woman of color in the Senate at the time. Since then, we've doubled the women of color each year. This year, we just added one, but she's very powerful, Senator Tawana Nobles. And so she counts for two, for sure. But also, you mentioned earlier, we also have increased the number of women in the Senate as well, where we are now more than the majority in the Senate Democratic Caucus. And so that also has changed in terms of what we prioritize, what our experiences are, how we experience this pandemic. And that is even more so in the House, where they now have most of the members of Color Caucus and the Black Caucus. But I think the other piece is that through this pandemic and through the remote session, we've had so many individuals who normally don't pay attention showing up to sign in to testify, sign in not wishing to speak, but putting in their opinion, including like a lot of young people in my district. They were paying attention not just to the bill going before us around ethnic curriculum, but what the underlying bill said. And they're like, what's up with this Becca bill? Why is this here? Why are we criminalizing youth under 21 when in a different and treating them differently than 18 or 19 or 20 year olds if they're caught with smoking? And these are all things that didn't normally happen, because although the professional lobbyists are, incredible and important, what it created is a more level playing field where, because normally who's down there when we're all down there, who's able to catch us in the hallway, who's able to have a little extra, watch when there's a question and come back with the answer. All of Washington was watching us in a different way, and were able to have more access to us. And I think that also helped us stay focused on and making sure that we're moving bills in the strongest way possible, as opposed to what was expedient in the past, because so many things are happening so quickly. So I think that definitely had an impact in how voices were heard, and how equity wasn't just, oh, we did this one thing. It was in every policy. I mean, there's so many bills that had the word equity in it this year, because we recognize that racial justice isn't just about police reform. It's about anti-Blackness and racism is embedded in every one of our institutions, in every one of our systems, in every one of our upbringing. And unless we recognize that, face it, and then start building practices and new systems to address that bias, it's going to stay and remain. It is persistent. And so I think that's a difference that we just couldn't even have that conversation in the Senate when I first got there. And the fact that it's even being part of a conversation now is progress. Maybe not the progress most Washingtonians would like to see, but it is definitely something that has given me a lot of hope.
Representative Fitzgibbon, I have this hypothesis that I will test on you, and I will preface it by saying I recognize that caucus dynamics are private for a reason, and certainly, if we look at previous House Democratic caucuses, I think Representative Chop was a strong speaker who nevertheless in many ways led from the back. I wonder if this session is possible on the House side primarily because, or importantly, maybe not primarily, but importantly because of Speaker Lori Jenkins. It seems to me that she may have had an outsized, though, arm's length approach, and that this might be chalked up as a unique set of wins for her. What do you think about Speaker Jenkins' role in this session in particular?
I think she deserves a lot of credit for the success of this session. And one of the distinguishing aspects of her speakership, which she made clear even before she was elected, was that she was going to, whenever possible, trust committee chairs to lead their policy area, while recognizing there's still oftentimes that the speaker and that the leadership needs to, add their voices to some of that thinking. But I think that she, operated as a problem solver for committee chairs in a way that was empowering, which is something that that Frank did too. I think that it's kind of more central to Lori's style is to say, like, what are the barriers to success for your committee's agenda, and how do we make sure that the whole caucus sees themselves reflected in that? So, I think it's inherent in the job of a leader to, provide that check on a committee chair. If you think the committee chair is missing something, maybe the committee chair, is, I'll speak for myself. If I was missing the politics of a bill, whether it's the external politics and what constituents might experience this bill, or maybe how this bill was going to be received by the Republicans or by the Senate, then often that's a question that Lori would ask, or that the rest of the leadership team would ask us to elevate. If the leadership team, Lori in particular, thought that we were not centering equity enough in a consideration around either a specific bill or the broader agenda, those kind of questions were questions that she, I think, saw as really central to her role to ask. But I, not to speak for her, but my interpretation of her behavior is if she thought that the committee chair was had thought about those things and was taking those things into account in what they were bringing forward for the caucus to consider, then she saw her role as how do I help these bills get passed? And so I definitely think that that matters. The whole legislative process is just a series of choke points. And whether in both chambers, even before bills get introduced, after they pass both chambers, and the magic of getting a big ambitious agenda through like we did this year is like trying to stay a couple steps ahead of each of those checkpoints. And that's something that I think that we're getting better at as time goes on. And I don't think that that's Lori alone. I think that that's, both House and Senate Democratic caucuses developing a little bit more muscle memory about what it means to, to have a strong majority and to move an ambitious agenda. And I think we get better at it as time goes on.
Representative Riccelli, the bipartisan nature of the legislature is meant, of course, to create some tension, to create a check from one party to the other. I think the House and Senate Republicans in press conferences made a point that they were trying to be as constructive this year as they could be without being needlessly antagonistic, as they said. Did you find that this was a more bipartisan session, or that there was less rancor because of the complexity of COVID, or was this business as usual for the most part?
Well, I certainly don't think it was business as usual. I actually think a lot of people did not think the experiment of the virtual session was going to be successful. And that's a big credit to our staff, to our leg tech folks, and just people taking a leap of faith that we can do it. And as was mentioned by my Senate counterparts, some of the first experiments of that were pretty difficult. But I think one of the things that might have slowed things down was you're not bumping, seeing people in committee and getting that work done. It's a little more scheduled. But I think the way that we were able to navigate and operate, and just the commitment, I do think there was a commitment with everything going on in national politics, and then how we entered our first day. I mean, driving through armed guards, National Guards people, Washington State Patrol, to say like, hey, we are going to get the people's work done. And I will give, I think, significant praise to our Republican leadership teams for saying we can have these fights and we're going to have these real value debates. But at the end of the day, I think there was a commitment to get the people's work done in the midst of a pandemic and solve big, complex public policy problems and get a budget that was going to really put Washington back on track. I do want to add as well the virtual nature. I think when we're talking about the diversity of opinions too, I mean, the virtual session really brought a lot of my Eastern Washingtonians, my constituents, to the table in ways the same way that Senator Saldaña was talking about, people engaging at every step of those choke points that Representative Fitzgibbon was mentioning at the committee hearings, and weighing in ways that I have not seen previously. And I think that will really enhance our public policy making process going forward. And I hope that we embrace it in a way that we haven't after seeing the trials of this session.
Senator Saldaña, Karen Parkhurst asks a question about this, the virtual nature of the session, and she wonders, from an equity standpoint, do you believe that having a remote legislative session improved access for people of color and people with disabilities and people with low incomes because they did not need to travel and so forth? Or were there some of the inherent inequities, the structural inequities maybe related to broadband or other connection issues, did those play out in a way that limited the engagement and role of some of our diverse communities?
Yeah, I mean, I think that is a great question, and it was one that we wrestled with our Republican caucus leaders, the counterpart leadership pre-session about, how would we make sure that people have access to equity? What does it mean to have open government and transparency? And so I think that was a concern of ours. But overall, I mean, what I saw was what she said is the fact that people didn't have to travel, the fact that they didn't have to take the whole day off from work or find childcare for the whole day in order to make that drive from Vancouver or from Yakima or from Spokane or from Seattle was huge. Especially we heard that loud and clear in our transportation committee with the disability community showing up to almost every one of our committee meetings with the stories about what it's like for 25% of the population that can't drive because of eye impairment issues, because of disability, because of age, because of all kinds of issues. And they were really incredible in being able to tell their story in testifying with us, signing up with us, but also by creating digital stories that are available to everyone to read. So I definitely saw that. As well as a lot of new efforts from Black organizations. There's a couple of new that became formal lobbyist operations showing up again on a whole array of bills and policies. And so I hope that what we'll see moving forward is, of course, some kind of hybrid that allows for the remote testimony and online ways for people to better engage with us, as well as, of course, you do lose. I mean, we all miss the difference of being able to sit across the table with each other, of having someone in your office and being able to be with you and share their story and have that connection too. Obviously, there is a loss with that as well, but definitely we had way more participants. Senator Dhigra might know the numbers because she would always share that in caucus, how many thousands of people testified on pieces of legislation.
Senator Dhigra, you have some of those numbers off the top of your head there?
You know, I do. If you give me 1 second, I can pull that up. To me, it was very important to actually pay attention to what the numbers tell us, right? Because we have to make sure the manner in which we're perceiving our session is actually accurate. So we had 67,700 people registered for public hearings without testifying. That's compared to 18,700 during the last 2-year session. That's 67,000 compared to 18,000. That's huge. This is democracy in action. And I can't tell you how excited that makes me feel because, I got into politics only 4 years ago. I literally hadn't attended a political party meeting until December of 2016. So for me, it's always been important to hear from people. When I run my committee meetings, I start with the individuals who the policy will impact. And then I move on to the lobbyists and the agency heads, because at the end of the day, the work that we do, we need to understand how it impacts the average human. And to see 67,700 people that signed in to express the support for a bill, to me, is just fantastic. And to me, I think that is part and parcel of why we were so successful this session in implementing laws that people want and they can feel that it impacts them. It's about broadband and access to them. They know they need it and they can see that we acted on it. They want to take a look at us fixing our tax system. They saw that. I'm fortunate enough to represent one of the wealthiest districts in our state. And during COVID, I had a neighbor whose house went up on sale. That house was sold within 2 hours. And this is where it was starting at, over $1 million. And we had people across the state who were losing their home, were scared of being evicted. We had food insecurity in a way we have not seen in this state. And people saw that inequity so clearly. So when we're able to rectify our upside down tax structure, they're interested because it's impacting them. They see that inequity. And so I think a lot of this has to do with how accessible we were to the general public this session.
Representative Riccelli, I was asked the other day about how this session will change the day-to-day lives of people, in 2021. I had made the argument that there were a lot of big pieces that moved that would be system level changes that would take some time to be implemented. How would you answer that question? How will this budget, this session, impact the lives of people in Washington State in 2021?
Well, we're meeting basic needs first and foremost, from housing to food assistance, healthcare with behavioral health access, et cetera. I think that they'll notice a change in that. For me, the big piece is that we followed through on our commitment to act quickly, swiftly, and in a way that your neighbors will talk to you about. Now, we're in the legislature, so, we're not like celebrities, but when you go down to the grocery market, when you have that conversation and somebody tells you about the story, and a lot of times it's them and a lot of times it's their family member or a friend and how they're struggling. I think that is what, we're coming away with, these huge investments in our most critical needs and our most basic needs. And then it's time to really move past that. We can pat ourselves on the back for meeting the needs in these critical times, but we're talking about a sustainable budget that goes forward that will really impact the lives, and not just, in this immediacy, in this time when people are desperate. What are we doing past that? And it puts us on a great footing. And I got to say, as Joe said, elections matter, and nationally, elections matter. And some of the relief, the COVID relief and the dollars that are coming in would not have been possible. We came into this session thinking, are we heading into another, recession type, battle where things that are most important to us, that are our deepest held values, are on the table to be cut? And we, thanks to federal assistance, but also thanks to some of our real push towards reform and our change in putting our values and putting people first in a way that we haven't done before, we came out of it. So that I do believe that the neighbors that I come across will talk about how they themselves, their kids, or their family members are being impacted positively.
Representative Fitzgibbon, in the legislation, if I recall correctly, that would eliminate fossil-fueled internal combustion engines being sold in cars in 2030 and beyond, that there's a contingency there to essentially replace the gas tax with some sort of road or mileage tax. Give us some sense of where that kind of, that's a big problem to solve. How do you replace the gas tax to fund transportation? Give us a sense of where some of those conversations are vis-a-vis your environmental policy committee.
Sure, and welcome my colleagues chiming in on this one too. I think maybe the provision around the phase out of gas powered cars has been a little bit overstated in some of the reporting. It's a goal. It was a bill that passed out of the House without that provision in it, House Bill 1287, and then in the Senate, another bill had been introduced by Representative Macri and Senator Leas that would actually have required a phase out of internal combustion engines by 2030, after 2030. This goal, not a mandate, was amended on to 1287 in the Senate. And I think that's great. I think it's good to have a goal like that. And then as a condition of that goal being added, there was also this provision saying the goal is contingent upon this road usage charge benchmark, which I don't know really how you make a goal contingent on a benchmark, but that's what it does. I think, the broader question over where are we in the transition to a road usage charge is there's a lot of skepticism about that idea from both, from both an environmental standpoint as well as from kind of a anti-tax standpoint. And I think that it's going to continue to inch forward very gradually. But I don't think we're ready to move towards a road usage charge in a broad way right now. I think that the category of vehicles where a road usage charge makes sense to me is electric vehicles that are not paying the gas tax, and that maybe the road usage charge. And I think Senator Saldaña maybe had a bill to this effect to reduce the car tabs, the punitive car tabs that electric vehicles currently pay. In exchange for a transition to a road usage charge for electric vehicles. I think that's a good step. When you talk about a road usage charge replacing the gas tax, that introduces some kind of perverse incentives around, potentially incentivizing more gas guzzlers be sold, as you lose the price incentive that the gas tax signal sends to drivers. So I think if we actually do get to a point in 2030 where we are rapidly moving away from gas-powered cars, which we probably are going to have to if we have any hope of achieving our climate targets, then yeah, we do want a structure in place like a road usage charge for vehicles that aren't paying the gas tax. But I think that the idea that I've heard the Transportation Commission and some others talk about, where you would actually replace the existing gas tax with a road usage charge, I think that's a little bit harder to see our way to.
Senator Saldaña, let me ask you to build on that. I think you were one of three, as I understood it, folks in the Senate with Senator Hobbs and Senator King trying to negotiate a package that could get across the finish line here for a larger, more ambitious transportation package. Give us a sense a little bit of how the kind of innovative fundings options are influencing that transportation package, how some of the legacy approaches are influencing that, and just a window into some of those politics and dynamics, because I think they're super interesting on transportation.
Yeah, no, thank you so much. So, where we were before and where we are now are different places. We now have the Climate Commitment Act, which has about $5.2 billion going towards transportation, carbon reduction, climate resiliency and adaptation. We also have the Clean Fuels Policy waiting for the governor's signature. Right. So I think it's really important that we're not starting where we were before with, and so Forward Washington, Chair Fai's approach, both of them need kind of a little reset, because now we know we have that core, and that should be how we center the future of transportation investments. I think the challenge of the historic way that we do package making and transportation is a lot of fancy, nice looking projects that will have good ribbon cutting ceremonies that are around the state. And we have, gotten used to a gas tax that, we don't have to do a lot of heavy lifting to get that to come into our revenue stream. But to build that gas system initially was not cheap, was not easy, and probably, was not popular. But so I think that's our challenge, is that what we have right now is a gas tax, and it's tied to the 18th Amendment, which says it has to be used for highway uses only. And it's a pretty narrow, historically narrow definition about what highway purposes are. And the challenge of we've seen a revenue decrease over time with the gas, as for many reasons. And one of the positive reasons why is when people make a better choice of either not getting a vehicle in the first place or choosing to have a clean fueled vehicle. And so that has been in the Senate, how do we make sure that no matter what kind of fuel you're using, if you're using the transportation system, how do you pay your fair share? The problem is the fair share, trying to make it comparable to the gas tax, is that we don't have enough revenue coming in. And so we could say that people that are driving right now aren't paying their fair share because it's not enough to actually build in preservation and maintenance. And so I think we need to kind of do a reset and say what we need is, what is the transportation system for the future that's going to meet the needs of Washingtonians? And then how, no matter what vehicle you're using, how do you get to contribute your fair share to help make that happen? And so I think it will be a couple of the revenue options that are out there right now that we definitely want to hear from all the people listening today. And you will probably see Representative Riccelli and I doing some kind of virtual tour, if not in person, to hear from you. So one is the gas tax with an inflator. This is something that is in dozens of states that are Republican, Democrat-led. And this is something that makes sense if we want to be serious about preservation and maintenance, because inflation is real. And for every package or any that we have, once you get to the 7th or 8th year and then it's your turn to get your project, it's always so much more expensive than what we put in the original package. So if you actually want your project in year 10 to come into fruition, a gas tax with an inflator is part of that. And then I think similar is thinking through, how do we get clean fueled vehicles when people are making a choice to have their own vehicle as opposed to using public transportation or having multiple vehicles? How do they pay so that they have smooth roadways? Because they have better efficiency when we have less potholes, when we have bridges that aren't going to fall down. And so, that is the idea of a road usage charge. And regardless of the bill not moving forward, we do have federal grant to help us work through those issues of how do we address privacy, how do we address equity, how do we make sure that it actually isn't creating some weird perverse disincentive for people to make better choices for our environment and for our communities. The other policy that I have written up but have not introduced as a separate bill, but it was in different versions of Forward Washington, was an air quality surcharge. And so this is, again, to help those that are making choices to buy gas-fueled, polluting-fueled vehicles, is to do a better job at the front of trying to anticipate the impact to our community and the real cost of that vehicle. And so it would put on a charge at the very beginning when you're purchasing your vehicle. And it is something that could be inflated. There's different levels that you can put that in, but that could raise some significant revenue to help us through a just transition so that everyone, and regardless of where you live, regardless of the environment, that you're able to make a choice that is not polluting our environment and that it allows you to get where you need to go, and make sure that we have bridges and highways that are not going to be flooded and that are not going to fall down when you need to get where you need to go. So those are a couple of the vehicles, and there's all kinds of little fees, but I think those three are the ones that are going to be core to getting us to a package that I think people would want to see to help us stimulate our economy and help us build back better.
So it sounds like you do not think there will be any special session to pass a grand bargain transportation budget in the next month or so?
Probably not a month. I do think we need to make sure that, because this is the thing, we had some business, we had some community really demanding this, but we didn't have the same kind. I'm told, I wasn't here in 2015, that there's a lot more pent up demand, a lot more synergy, and we're waiting to hear from that. I know that we have folks that are wanting to champion, and we have needs, but I think we want to make sure that these revenues are ones that resonate with Washingtonians, because at the end of the day, we cannot pass something if it's not going to withstand community, if the community is not going to be behind it so that they can feel excited about it. And so that, ideally, we want to have bipartisan support, because a transportation package is something that is going to help every business and every community across our state.
Good stuff. Senator Rebecca Saldaña, Deputy Majority Leader in the Senate. Senator Manka Dhigra, Deputy Majority Leader in the Senate as well. Representative Joe Fitzgibbon, the Chair of the House Environment and Energy Committee and Majority Whip in the House, and Gonzaga University alum, Representative Marcus Riccelli from the great 3rd District of Washington State. Thank you guys for doing this. Thank you for TVW cross-posting and airing this at their site and their channel, and thank you for being in our audience today. We'll have more conversations like this one throughout the summer here at the Washington State Wire. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks for joining us in this virtual conversation and for your support of our work at Washington State Wire.